Okay, thank you for joining us today on this edition of Investigation Bible. I'm Bill Kaufman, your biblical investigator, and I'm now 10:8 with this episode. All right, today we're going to be discussing I've gone through a litany of things on this show from archaeology, the histories and stuff, some science, some prophecies, some different things, some people's lives, and how this Bible has affected humanity to some degree or another. And I'm going to continue with that for some time to come. Because it's not just the church that this thing is affected. I mean, literature and everything else, art. The Bible has had a gigantic impact on the world, not just, you know, the modern world, the Middle Ages and the ancient times and everything else. It's just had a huge impact on the world. And in fact, there's a book that was written, If the Bible Has Never Been Written, and it just basically went through all these statements of Solomon, or the works of the things that Christ did, and the hospitals and the universities that were built, and because universities came from the church and hospitals came from the church. In fact, hospitals come from a group called the Hospitalers. And so, I mean, all these things, uh, that's a lot of this stuff came from. All right. So now education came about before that for sure, but education to the masses so that the average person could read the scriptures in their own languages and everything, this all came about because of the Bible and a lot of art and everything else. Sistine Chapel, what have you, the David by Michelangelo. Um, it's just pretty amazing. But I'm still going to talk a little bit more, not just about things like at that time, but stuff such as who is in the Bible. What does it talk about? I mean, why do we even have, what's in there? Now, so I figured we'd do a couple of weeks, maybe a series of talking about people that are in the Bible. These are people that you've probably heard of. These are people that you might know about, but you may not know like when they lived or all that kind of stuff. So I thought it might be a good idea to go through some of the more famous people that the average person knows. Because, like I said, the Bible has affected everybody. We'll start off right with the beginning of Adam and Eve. Now, I mean, in modern terminology, we still call that, the beginnings of stuff, Adam. Oh, and in movies, it talks about Adam and Eve. In literature, it talks about Adam and Eve, the first mother and father, okay? And everybody knows that story, is in the Bible. Now, I'm not going to say everybody believes it. I do, but not everybody does. I get that. But you know it. There really isn't hardly anybody in educated society of the modern era that doesn't know who Adam and Eve are, or at least heard of them and know the story behind them. In fact, they're so famous, and even their kids' stories, that just in everyday language we utilize it. I remember when I was in the Army, we were in formation, and we had a guy in our company that was named Cain, last name of Cain, and we had a guy named Abel, last name of Abel. And I remember really well that they're going through roll call, and we're all in formation for some reason, and Cain was there, but Abel was not. And I remember the drill sergeant at the time, this was an AIT, and the drill sergeant at that time yells, for Abel, and he doesn't answer up or whatever. And when he doesn't answer a couple of yells, the drill sergeant yelled it for Cain. He's like, Cain, what did you do with Abel? Because we all know the story, okay? Almost everybody does. And that is the story of Adam and Eve had a son. His name was Cain. Then a little bit later, they had another son. His name was Abel. Now, they had a lot of other kids during this time, a whole bunch of them. And as they grew up, Cain and Abel are now grown-ups, and they get into a disagreement, and they get into an argument and a fight, and Cain kills Abel. First murder recorded. I don't know if there was any other murders before that. Doesn't tell us that, but, doesn't tell us there wasn't either. But this is definitely the first recorded homicide, and it's by a guy named Cain. to his brother Abel. We all know the story, though. We all know it. And therefore, this made everybody laugh. All right. Everybody in my AIT across the board. I wasn't a Christian yet. I knew the story. I laughed. What happened was funny. And then, of course, the drill sergeant's like, well, okay, you're all laughing. That's fine. But now we got to log it up. and we did and everything. And by the way, in that case, Abel, I don't remember why he wasn't there. I have no memory of why he wasn't there, but he was not killed by at all, much less by the guy named Cain. he survived, all right. I don't know how well he survived for not making it to formation. I don't remember that, but probably got punished pretty good. But we all know the story. So we'll start with Adam and Eve, and that's God made Adam, and then out of Adam's rib, he put him to sleep. And actually, the people that have the doctor that invented anesthesia, he got the idea from that story in the Bible. He said, okay, so God put Adam to sleep before he had an operation on him. So before we have operations, because back in the old days, doctors, especially in the Civil War days, they learned a lot in Civil War days on how to fix stuff because the battle was so horrendous. And doctors were getting a lot of practice on fixing human injuries, okay? But they did it when they were awake. And therefore you watch the old movies where you just bite on a bullet, and as they're digging the other bullet out of somebody or what have you. And but then the doctor that came up with anesthesia, he got it from this story in the Bible. He's reading the Bible. God put Adam to sleep. He said, that's a good idea. Let's develop something to put people to sleep while they're getting an operation. And now, voila, 20th century, we do that. We don't operate on people if we can help it without putting them under anesthesia. But God put Adam under anesthesia of some sort, don't know what, and took a rib out and used that DNA of the deoxyribonucleic acid and everything else to develop a female version of human, because humans are male and female. God made us human, male and female, made him us. That's what it says in the Bible. He made us humans, male and female. He also made all kinds of creatures, male and female. And you can't really have babies without it and all that kind of stuff. But he made Eve out of Adam's rib. Then they had a couple of kids, and one of them killed the other. Then it does record they had another kid. They had a lot of other children. A lot. These are just the ones that we were told the names of. Okay? And they had kids who had kids who had kids until one of these guys was named Noah. Okay? When Noah was born, he was the great-grandson, I believe, of a guy named Enoch. Enoch was a godly man. It talks about him. We have the book of Enoch. I don't think that's actually from Enoch's time. I think it's much later. But nonetheless, we have a guy named Enoch that didn't die before the flood. God took him. It just says he walked with God and God took him away. So he didn't die, okay? And then he had a son, Methuselah, who had a son he lived the longest time. And then, in fact, it even says that his name means, he's going to live until God destroys everything or something to that effect. And that guy is his grandson, Noah. Noah's born. And we all know Noah. Methuselah, we still hear about him. Enoch, we might hear about him. Definitely Methuselah, because we talk about old people being Methuselah, because he lived the longest. I think it's 969 years before the flood. Before the flood, people lived a lot longer. But anyway, Noah is on the earth now, and that's the grandson of Methuselah. I think the great-grandson, I believe, of Enoch. I didn't look it up today, but I think that's how that worked. But Noah's on the earth, and God actually tells him, hey, the place is messed up. And Noah says, yeah, no duh, man, this is terrible. It says that there was violence constantly, and there was only evil in the heart of man. And that God was like, man, you guys are messing up bad. I got to start over. And so anyway, there's a lot of spiritual stuff going on here, I believe, even with the sons of God coming to the daughters of men and all this stuff. It does talk about this, but I'm not going to get into any of that. But it does talk about it. I think there's a lot of really weird stuff going on at this time that we don't understand because God didn't let it happen again. But it did happen back then. And then so God destroys the whole world by a flood, but he tells Noah, and that's who we know, um, to build an ark, and his three sons and their daughters get on that ark and they survive. And you know that every people group around the world, ancient people group, have a story of the flood. All of them. When I was going to college years ago, I've talked about this guy many times, but I had a religion class leader. I didn't go to a Christian school; it was just secular school. But he was not a believer. In fact, quite the opposite. He tried to talk you out of believing the Bible, and he actually said, he goes, look, the story of the flood and Noah isn't unique to the Bible. All ancient peoples have this story. It's across all ancient religions, all ancient archaeological digs. We find stories of this flood amongst everybody. So all the story in the Bible is its own version of this ancient, probably Babylonian story of the flood. And that's all it is. It's just a recopy of that. Well, that would be fine if it was the exact same story, but it's not even close to the exact same story. Even though they all have stories of the flood, they vary quite significantly. And but anyway, I remember raising my hand in the class and I asked a question. I was already a Christian when I took this class. I wasn't earlier in life, but I was a Christian by this time. And I raised my hand and I said, and I asked the professor, and I said, well, is it possible that everybody has a memory or has a story of the flood because it's an actual memory of everybody's that lived back then? And yeah, he didn't like that at all. He was trying to make a point, and I was arguing his point. Now he's smarter than I am, more educated than I am, and everything else. But he did know, he probably had heard that argument before, and just didn't think anybody was going to bring it up. But yeah, the reason everybody has a story in ancient times of the flood is because it happened. And they all have a memory of it. Now, they mess up the memory just like when Moses was alive. Now, the reason we have the story of Noah is it's in the book of Genesis. The reason we have the book of Genesis is because when Moses was around, that's 3,500 years ago, he wrote it down because he was talking to God on a mountain who said, by the way, you've heard of the flood. And Moses would have said, yeah, I know there was a worldwide flood. And he goes, and he probably knew the story of Gilgamesh or something, which was very popular. And he goes, yeah, I know the story of the flood. I know how that worked out. He goes, well, no, you got the wrong story. This is the real guy. His name was Noah. And this is how big he built the ark. And this is how this worked. And because he gives the dimensions of the ark. And that's important. Because Noah, who, I don't know how long ago Noah lived. Some people think they got it all figured out. Fine. I don't know. He lived a long time ago. And but we do know the dimensions of the ark that he built, the boat that he built, and it will float. But no other ancient peoples have that story. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, which I love, it's a great story. Oh my gosh, I actually think it's terrific. One of the oldest stories known to man, and it's out. It's a wonderful story. Please read it. But his story, it's a cube. It's a big block. And the rain only lasted a couple days, and the flood, took this block and raised it up and took it around. Okay, if you had animals and everything else inside a block that was in an ocean that was bobbing up and down, it would flip up and over and over and over and over and kill everything in it. But that's not the case because the Epic of Gilgamesh is a memory of something that happened before it, the flood. But it got it wrong. Moses didn't know the right story when he started writing Genesis. God did because he was an eyewitness and he told him. Okay. So anyway, that's the story of Noah, and then they get off the boat, and then it even says that it was above every part of land at one point. No, this is when a lot of upheaval happened. There's no doubt about that. So this is when probably the mountains that got really tall through plate tectonics actually happened. I believe that's when a lot of this happened during that flood time, which I don't know how long ago it was. Don't have any idea. And but then they come down in a place called the Ararat. Now we have a mountain of Ararat, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's that one because in those days it was when it was written, it was a mountain range of Ararat, kind of like the Rocky Mountains. Okay, where's the Rocky Mountains? Well, it goes from Canada all the way down. It's a very big, long range. Sierra Nevada, same thing. So they're long. There's a whole bunch to it. Well, we don't know exactly where in Ararat that landed. But when it did, they got off the boat and they started a new society. And they had kids who had kids who had kids who had kids. And eventually this guy shows up that you've heard about, and his name's Abraham. Now, by the time Abraham shows up on the earth, there's a lot of city-states going on. And he's from one of them. And that is in Ur of the Chaldeans. And now this is the first time we can really date this, okay? When Adam was on the earth, when Enoch was on the earth, when Methuselah was on the earth, when Noah was on the earth, when Gilgamesh was on the earth. I don't know what years those were. I don't know how long ago that was. And no one does. And it's speculation. But by the time we get to this Abraham guy, we do know how long ago that was. It was about 4,000 years ago. That's a long time, I know. But we've got the written record of a guy that lived 4,000 years ago that God told Moses to write down. And he told him to write it down 3,500 years ago. So about 500 years after Abraham was around that Moses wrote these stories down. But he didn't even know the accurate stories because they'd been lost. It was just oral tradition up until the time that God told Moses to write this stuff down. And he did. And that's the book of Genesis. And so we've got this guy named Abraham who's from a city in modern day Iraq, which we know where that city is. It's called Ur, U-R. And Ur is a pretty big city at the time. It was right on the river there, the Euphrates, right on the Euphrates. And they even had running water through the city because they dug canals to go through their city from the Euphrates, and honestly, it took care of everything. They brought them fresh water. It also took away their debris. It was a fairly clean city, and we've actually uncovered the ancient city of Ur. And something else is interesting. They actually had graffiti. Now, not like our day graffiti. It wasn't like a modern gang graffiti, but there was writings on the wall. It was in Rome too, and it's just so fascinating that we have all these little things we still do that we think is so, us, but they actually had graffiti on the walls of Ur and 4,000 years ago, and they had graffiti on the walls of Rome 2,000 years ago. So, I mean, I just think that's interesting. That's all. It's not important at all, but funny. Anyway, he's from Ur. He is being raised there by his father, and he has brothers, a couple of them that is mentioned, and things like that. And his father's name is Terah. It tells us his father's name in the Bible. And Terah had some sons, and one of them is Abraham. At some point, and we don't know where, Abraham meets God, the real God, the true God. Now, they had their own gods. In fact, the god of Ur was the moon god at that time. That's who they worshipped. That's who Abraham grew up worshiping. He didn't know anything better. But somehow he meets the true God. I don't know how. It does not explain this in the scriptures. And we don't have any history that explains it to us, but he does. And God speaks to him. He knows it's God, and he believes God. And because he believes God, it's counted unto him as righteousness. Not that he was righteous, just like me. I'm not righteous. I'm not good. Because Jesus died on the cross, and I believe in him. I am righteous. Not because I am, but because he is. And on judgment day, I will be looked upon as righteous. And that I'm sinless, not because I am, but because Jesus is. Well, it's kind of before Jesus by 2,000 years, but it's the same principle. He believed God, and it was counted to him righteousness. And God told him to leave Iraq, because that's where they were at. It's actually Ur of the Chaldeans. But he says, I want you to leave Iraq, and I want you to move over to this promised land that I'm going to give to you. Okay. And by the way, I'm going to make you the father of a whole bunch of nations. Okay, sounds like a plan. Let's go. So eventually he loads up and they move up north, and they move top of the Fertile Crescent. You probably read about the Fertile Crescent when you were young in school and all that kind of stuff. Well, Abraham moves to the top of the Fertile Crescent. And when he gets up there, he stays a little while until his father dies, because his father's getting really old now. And his father dies off. And then he comes down. Remember, now, if you look at a map, you can see this. But Iraq, and then the top of the Fertile Crescent would be in where Turkey is now, I would imagine. And then they came down into where Israel is now today. So they kind of made an A, up and down, because there's a desert across here. You can cross it, but it's not that not with a whole family, because Abraham has a whole family of people, not just family, because he has no children yet, but he has a wife, he has his brothers, died. One of his brothers had already died, and he has his son with him. He has his father with him. Probably had a whole bunch of people that were working for him because he was a fairly wealthy guy. So they didn't go across the desert. They went up north and stayed in the cities up along the rivers. And then they made it eventually. But then after Terah died, they went down into where we call the promised land, Israel. And God had him look at everything, walk it off. I'm going to give you all this stuff. That's what he told him. And I'm going to give it to your descendants. Abraham don't got no descendants, okay? He got no children. And so he says, all right, God, I believe you, but I don't know how this is going to work out. Eventually, I'm not going to get into all the intricacies of it, but eventually he decides, Sarah, actually, his wife decides, I'm too old to have kids, and so have a kid with my handmaid. And that was Hagar. And that was the person that worked for him, and like a servant type thing. That was what they did in those days. You did that. I mean, if a couple couldn't have kids, they wanted to have kids. They did this through this system. It was actually not just these people did it. It's written across the ancient writings from the Nuzian tablets. We learn these type of procedures and everything else, different writings and different things of that time. Okay, so this is what he did. He did what they would do in their time. Kind of like we would do a surrogate mother. Well, they did a surrogate mother, but not giving up the baby. I mean, out of the womb. The woman had the child, but then it was considered the child of the person that hired them to do this. All right. Kind of an adoption. I'm adopted. It's a similar type situation, but this is how they did it back then. All right. And so they have a son. They name him Ishmael. But God says that's not the promised one. That's not the one I told you was going to, that the blessings of the whole world were going to happen. Because he does tell Abraham, through you and your descendants, the whole world will be blessed. But he's like, not through Ishmael. And so they don't know how this is going to work. It took another almost 15 years. I think I read 14 years before Sarah gets pregnant. And she's an old lady. She cannot have a baby. It's a miracle. God waited till she couldn't do it so that it could be absolutely perfectly presented as a miracle, and a son named Isaac is born. Okay, Abraham's pretty old too, but he does live a lot longer because he raises Isaac. And then Isaac, he ends up having a couple of sons, and they fight with each other from the womb, and they fight with each other their whole life, and that's Esau and Jacob, and they fight with each other all their life until the very last time they meet, and then they get along. So I think that's something. But anyway, they don't get along, but they become the father of different nations themselves. Esau becomes the father of some people that lived on the one side of the Jordan, and that kind of stuff. But what it focuses on is not Esau, but Jacob. Jacob goes up north where his family had stopped back when his great-grandfather was dying, and he comes down, he goes back up there and lives there for quite a few years. He ends up marrying two girls. In those days that was common, and they were sisters, and it's a big long story, and we can get into it, but that happened a long time ago. Anyway, so Jacob has all these kids, 12 sons and a daughter, and these 12 sons and a daughter, they end up becoming the nation of Israel. Okay, you got the 12 tribes of Israel, right? Well, that's because of these people, and that's how that worked. Jacob had 12 sons that became the 12 tribes of Israel, from Judah to Levi to there's a whole bunch, Benjamin. There's a whole bunch of them. I don't have them all memorized off the top of my head, but of these 12 tribes, that is the great-grandsons of Abraham. And then they become a nation eventually, but not for a while, because they actually all moved down to, Joseph was one of the sons. They all moved down to Egypt, and Joseph becomes the prime minister of Egypt. And then they live in a nice area of it for a while. But then things don't stay nice forever, and they kind of lose it. And when they lost the land and or their freedom, they were slaves for quite a few years, quite a few hundred years. And then a guy named Moses shows up. So when Moses shows up, he is called by God to free the people from slavery. But this is hundreds of years, okay, later. And when Moses shows up, he goes to the Pharaoh at the time. It's probably Tutmosis the fourth, I think. There's a lot of speculation on it, and it's just speculation. It doesn't really matter. They go, and the Pharaoh says, "No, I'm not going to let you go." And then God performs some miracles, and eventually they get let go. I mean, it's 10 plagues in Egypt, and we can watch the 10 Commandments with Charlton Heston and learn about them. Just kidding. Probably read your Bible to learn about it. But the 10 Commandments with Charlton Heston is pretty good. And then Moses goes on the other side of away from Egypt, on the other side of the Red Sea, and goes up to the where we call the Promised Land area, and that's Israel, modern Israel and stuff today. And he goes up there, and as he's up there, God sits him down on a mountain and tells him stuff. And I'm going to finish this first episode of Bible people, I guess we'll call it, with this story right here. Moses sits on a hill on top of Mount Sinai, and God tells him stuff, and he writes it down. That's how we know it. That's how we know all this stuff. The only reason we know who Adam and Eve are, because they've been forgotten by Moses this time. Moses lived 3,500 years ago. By the time he showed up on this earth, nobody knew the stories accurately of Adam and Eve. They didn't know who Enoch was. They didn't know the stories of Noah properly. They knew there was a worldwide flood, but everybody had a misunderstanding of it. Okay, and that makes sense because they didn't even have writing right after it happened, and so it was all oral traditions, and different people moved away from each other, and they had different oral traditions, but every people group had the story of this flood. Well, because it happened and they all were remembering it, they were just remembering it maybe a little incorrectly, okay? God sat down with Moses and talked to him as one man talks to another. It's the only person we know that's recorded that God did that with, okay? Moses and God talked as two friends. And he told him all these things, and he wrote them all down. And that's what he did. And as he wrote them down, we now, 3,500 years later, know who Adam and Eve are. We know who Cain and Abel were. We know who Enoch was. We know who Methuselah was. We know who Enoch was. We know who Terah was. We know who Abraham was. We know who Isaac was. We know who Ishmael was. We know who Jacob was. We know who Esau was. We know who Jacob's 12 sons and daughters were. And all that stuff, all because he sat down and told him, and he wrote it down, and we still have it. And that's what we would call the book of Genesis. So I've kind of gone through the book of Genesis there, and starting of Exodus with some famous people. It's a real quick overview, but at least it gives you kind of an idea. From the Adam, we don't know how long ago that was. I don't know, and I'm not going to speculate. Even Noah, I don't know how long ago that was. Can't really speculate. Don't have enough information to make a firm decision. I remember a few years ago, my granddaughter, she's now 16, but when she was little, she comes to me and she says something, and I can't remember what it was, but she says, "Well, that would be my hypothesis." And I was like, "What? How do you know the word hypothesis?" She was like 4 or maybe 5. I don't remember, but she was a little girl. And she said, "That would be my hypothesis." Well, I started questioning her on if she even knew what the word meant, and she did. She got it right. She knew what hypothesis meant. But what really, the reason she knew about it eventually, I found out, was because what I eventually found out was that she was watching something called Dinosaur Train on television. And Dinosaur Train used the word hypothesis and properly in a sentence, so she would use it. And when these people lived, I don't have enough information to even make a hypothesis, okay? I don't, and I'm not going to try. But by the time Abraham showed up, we do know. And he lived about 4,000 years ago. They were building the pyramids. The Great Pyramid was already built in Gaza. That was already built. Giza. That was already built. But he went down to Egypt and back and forth himself. Egypt was the big big city on the block in those days. And but he went down there and back and different things. He lived at that time 4,000 years ago. And then about 500, then a bunch of stuff happened over the next 500 years, and Moses shows up. And we now know Moses. But in between then, we have guys like Joseph, who coat of many colors guy. We have Jacob. And by the way, Jacob, the grandson of Abraham, right? He was named Israel by God. God changed his name from Jacob to Israel. And that's the reason we have the nation of Israel right now. Because 4,000 years ago, almost, God's wrestling really with, like we wrestle with God right now. He allowed Jacob to wrestle with him, and he had him, and he said, "I'm no longer going to be called Jacob. You're going to be called Israel." And right now, we have a nation called Israel because of that event almost 4,000 years ago. I mean, these are things I wanted to bring up and say, this is why this Bible is so important. Even if you don't believe it for a spiritual thing, which I do, but even if you don't, you can't even really understand why we have a nation of Israel unless you understand where it came from. And that's understanding our Bible. So anyway, that's about it. This week, we've talked about a few people. And next week, I'm going to talk about a few more people that are kind of famous in the Bible and when they lived. Because from Moses on, we can date when everybody lived. We know when they lived historically. So from everybody on, we're going to be able to do a little bit of study in history about when they were alive. However, up to Moses, 3,500 years ago, we at least know that. Maybe Abraham, 4,000 years ago. And as we move forward, I hope you join us. I'm now 10:10 on this episode. Hope you join us again. Thank you very much.